It was the day I finally decided to take control of my life. One of those rare moments when everything just falls into place, or so I thought. I had been living in my newly purchased house for almost a year now, but something about the neighborhood didn't sit right with me. The streets were pristine, the neighbors polite but distant, and the air was always thick with tension, like a storm waiting to break. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I had just returned from a business trip, walking up the driveway with a suitcase in hand, when I noticed a small group gathered near my front door. At first, I thought it was a group of neighborhood kids playing, but as I drew closer, I could see that they weren't kids at all. The group was led by a woman in a crisp, immaculately pressed suit, her blonde hair tied back in a way that screamed authority. She was holding something in her hands, something official. As I approached, I heard her speaking in a voice that was too confident, too demanding. "We need to talk about your house now," she said, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. I froze. This wasn't just any neighbor. This was Karen, and Karen wasn't just a name. It was a title she wore with pride. She was the HOA president, the kind of person who believed she had the right to run everyone's life. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" I asked, trying to maintain my calm, but I could already feel the heat rising in my chest. "We've been notified that you've made several modifications to your property that are against neighborhood regulations," Karen continued, looking at me like I was a criminal. "And, frankly, you're violating our community rules, which will result in serious consequences unless you pay up." Pay up? What did she mean? My mind raced, trying to piece together what she was saying. I had barely touched the house since I moved in, except for some minor repairs that didn't even require any special permissions. There was no way I could have done something wrong. "I haven't done anything wrong," I said firmly, but the pit in my stomach kept growing. Karen's smile widened, as if she had been waiting for me to say that. "Well, we have a solution then. We are requesting a fee to cover the necessary adjustments to bring your property up to HOA standards. It's a one-time payment, of course. Think of it as a community fee. It's the only way to resolve this smoothly." It hit me like a punch to the gut. She was asking me to pay rent for the house I already owned, not just for the land, but for the privilege of living in my own home. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to pay you for my own house?" I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. Karen nodded, unblinking. "That's right. And if you don't pay, we will be forced to take legal action. It's for the good of the neighborhood, after all." My blood ran cold. Legal action? This couldn't be happening. I had heard stories of HOA corruption before, but never this blatant. They were literally extorting people for doing nothing more than living their lives. But I wasn't going to back down. "Okay," I said, feigning compliance. "I'll take care of it." But in reality, I had no intention of paying her a dime. I turned and walked into my house, my heart pounding. As I closed the door behind me, I realized something. Karen had underestimated me. This wasn't just a battle for my property. This was going to be war. I stood in my living room, staring at the letter Karen had given me. It felt like my entire life was suddenly in jeopardy, and I was just trying to process everything. I had already spent countless hours renovating the house, pouring my heart and soul into it. Now, this woman, this HOA tyrant, was trying to take control of my future in this neighborhood. The nerve. I paced back and forth, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't just roll over and give in. There was something deeply wrong with the way she was running things. But how far would she go? If she was willing to demand rent for my own home, what else was she capable of? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. It wasn't long before I started making calls. I contacted a lawyer to get his opinion on this so-called community fee, and the advice I got was as frustrating as it was enlightening. According to him, the HOA had no legal right to make such a demand. It was nothing more than a blatant scam, and if I stood my ground, they would be forced to back off. But this wasn't just about the money. It was about my right to live peacefully in my own space without some power-hungry woman trying to control me. The lawyer advised that I gather as much evidence as possible. "Document everything," he said. "Take pictures of the property, record every conversation, and keep every letter she sends." That was the plan. I started jotting down every interaction I had with Karen, keeping track of her ever-changing rules and demands. I made my way to the local records office the next morning to check the legality of her claims. I wanted to see if there was any truth behind her supposed community fee that the other homeowners were apparently paying. What I found shocked me. There were no fees like the ones Karen had been mentioning. The HOA was running a completely different scheme altogether. Feeling both enraged and empowered, I decided it was time to confront Karen. I had all the evidence I needed, and I was going to show her that I wasn't afraid. I knew I had to approach her carefully. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but I also knew I wasn't going to let her get away with this. The next day, I marched up to her house. She had a pristine, white picket fence and a lawn that looked like it had been taken directly out of a suburban dream. She was sitting on her porch, sipping a drink, as if she owned the entire block. "Karen," I said, my voice firm as I stood at the edge of her porch. She looked up from her magazine, eyes narrowing when she saw me standing there. "What is it now?" she asked, not even attempting to hide her annoyance. "I've looked into your demands," I began, showing her the stack of paperwork I had brought. "And it turns out you have no legal right to charge me for anything. This is just an extortion racket, and I won't be paying." Karen's face twisted in an expression of pure disdain. "You're just another one of those troublemakers," she muttered. "You think you can just walk away from this without consequences?" "I'm not walking away from anything." "You are," I said, slamming the paperwork down onto the table. "Because I'm going to the press with this. I'm going to expose everything you've been doing. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a low, menacing chuckle. "You think you can scare me?" she asked, standing up and walking toward me. "You think people will actually believe you over me? I've been in charge of this neighborhood for years. I have connections. I can make your life a living hell." Her words stung, but I stood my ground. "We'll see who has the power once this hits the news," I said calmly, my heart pounding. "But mark my words, Karen, you will regret this. I won't be the one backing down this time." She glared at me for a few more seconds, her nostrils flaring as if she was considering her next move. Then, she turned on her heel and marched back into her house, slamming the door behind her. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had won anything, but I knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. Karen had just underestimated me, and she had no idea what I was capable of. The next few days were a whirlwind. I had contacted a journalist from a local news outlet, explaining everything that had happened with Karen and the HOA's shady tactics. She was intrigued, but also skeptical. After all, people like Karen usually had their way with local communities, and the idea of an outsider going up against her was bound to raise some eyebrows. But I was determined, and the journalist promised to look into it. I wasn't about to sit idly by while Karen manipulated everyone around her. I spent hours researching HOA regulations, browsing through community rules and regulations, and digging into past complaints. There was nothing in the official documents that even remotely resembled the community fee Karen was pushing. In fact, her actions were starting to look even more suspicious. That's when I started getting phone calls. At first, they were from neighbors who wanted to know what was going on, wondering why Karen had come after me. Then, some of them began reaching out privately, saying they had been afraid to speak up but didn't agree with what Karen was doing. The more I heard, the more I realized I wasn't just fighting for my house anymore. This was bigger than me. Karen was taking advantage of people, and it was time for someone to stand up to her. One afternoon, I received a surprise visit from one of the neighbors who had called me earlier. It was Mrs. Stevens, an elderly woman who lived down the street. She had always been quiet, rarely leaving her house, but she had a reputation in the neighborhood for being sharp and well-informed. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice shaky but firm. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. "What's going on, Mrs. Stevens?" She looked around cautiously, making sure no one was listening. "I've been living here for over 30 years, she began, sitting down on my couch. "And I've never seen anything like this. Karen has been running the HOA with an iron fist for years. No one dares to question her because she has connections with people in the local government. But you're different." I raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do you mean?" "She's been trying to force everyone to comply with her rules, even if they aren't in the books. I've had to pay extra fees just for basic maintenance she should be covering, and I know other neighbors have been forced to do the same," she said, her voice cracking. But no one has ever had the courage to fight back before. The weight of her words sank in. Karen had been doing this for years, and I was the first person to stand up to her. I wasn't just challenging her. I was going to bring down her entire operation. But this was bigger than I thought. The more people I talked to, the clearer it became that Karen had been exploiting the entire neighborhood for her own gain. "We need to stop her, for good," Mrs. Stevens said, her eyes burning with determination. "You're not just fighting for your house anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's been silenced by her." I nodded, the pieces falling into place. This wasn't just about proving Karen wrong. This was about taking down someone who had been manipulating a whole community. I wasn't going to let her get away with it any longer. "I'll take care of it," I said, my voice steady. "We're going to expose her, and once we do, no one will ever trust her again." Mrs. Stevens smiled, relieved. "You're the first person to ever stand up to her, and I'll do whatever I can to help." As she left, I sat back down on the couch, my mind racing. I knew that now, more than ever, I had to win this. Not just for myself, but for everyone Karen had hurt. I was going to take her down, and I wasn't going to stop until I did. The following days were spent gathering every shred of evidence I could find. I knew Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight, so I made sure to cover every angle. I had already started recording conversations with her, subtle enough that she didn't catch on, and I kept every document she had sent me. The more I compiled, the clearer it became. Karen was operating outside the law. Her community fees weren't just illegal, they were extortion. And I had the proof to back it up. But I knew I needed more. A few of the neighbors who had reached out to me were eager to help, but they were too afraid of retaliation from Karen and her allies in the HOA. I couldn't blame them. Karen had a way of making people feel like they didn't stand a chance. It was how she stayed in power. The community had been living in fear for too long. That's when I decided to go public. It was a huge risk, but it was the only way to expose her for who she really was. I called the journalist from the local news outlet and told her everything. She was skeptical at first, but as I laid out the facts and showed her the documents, her tone shifted. She agreed to meet with me the next day. When she arrived, I could see the disbelief on her face. She was expecting a typical Karen story, but this was different. The proof was irrefutable. The HOA had been abusing its power for years, and Karen was the ringleader. I felt a surge of adrenaline as she snapped pictures of the documents I had laid out on the table. "This is unbelievable," the journalist said, shaking her head. "I can't believe no one has come forward before." "People have tried," I said, my voice tight. But Karen made sure they were too scared to speak out. She has connections, and anyone who challenged her was made to look like a troublemaker. But I'm done being quiet. She smiled at me, a look of admiration in her eyes. "You've got the story of a lifetime here. We're running this." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel hopeful. We were going to expose Karen and her corrupt HOA, and there was no way she could talk her way out of this one. But Karen was not going to make this easy. The moment the article was published online, my phone started blowing up. Emails, calls, even texts from people I had never heard of. The story had gone viral. The entire neighborhood was in an uproar, and Karen was nowhere to be found. I could already feel the heat on my back. This was the storm I had been expecting, and I had no idea what Karen would do next. Just as I was about to sit down for dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door, expecting it to be another neighbor wanting to express support. But to my surprise, standing on my doorstep was Karen herself, her face a mask of fury. "You've made a huge mistake," she said, her voice low and threatening. "I think you're the one who made the mistake, Karen," I replied, crossing my arms. "The truth is out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." She narrowed her eyes. "You don't understand what you've started. You think you can take me down? You have no idea what you're up against. The HOA has more power than you think." I wasn't intimidated. "It's over, Karen. The whole neighborhood knows the truth now. You're done." But she wasn't finished. "You think you're the only one with secrets?" she hissed. "I'll make sure this goes down in flames for you. You'll wish you never crossed me." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't show it. I wasn't going to back down. Do your worst. It's already too late for you. Karen's expression twisted into something darker. We'll see about that. She turned and stormed off, slamming the door behind her. But as she walked away, I could feel the weight of her words. She was dangerous, and she wasn't going to give up easily. The following week felt like a whirlwind of activity. The news article had sparked a chain reaction. Calls kept coming in. Some were supportive, some were threats, and some were from people who had been living in the neighborhood for decades, waiting for the right moment to finally speak out about Karen's tyrannical rule over the HOA. But while the community seemed to be waking up, Karen was not going to take this lying down. It started with small acts of retaliation. My mailbox was destroyed. My car got a strange scratch on it, and I noticed that someone had even poured something on my lawn that looked suspiciously like we'd kill her. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just paranoid. But soon enough it became clear. Karen was taking this battle to the next level. But I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. I had already gone public. I had my neighbors backing me up, and I was gaining more supporters every day. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I was determined to see this through. One night, as I was sitting at my kitchen table, trying to organize all the evidence I had gathered, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the last time Karen had knocked, it hadn't ended well. I walked to the door, my pulse quickening, and opened it cautiously. To my surprise, it wasn't Karen standing there. It was Mrs. Stevens again, but this time she wasn't alone. She was with another neighbor, a man named Greg who had lived in the area for years and had always kept to himself. "We need to talk," Mrs. Stevens said, looking over her shoulder nervously. I let them in, immediately sensing that something was off. Greg looked uneasy, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, but Mrs. Stevens was resolute. "Karen's losing it," she said, lowering her voice. "She's getting desperate. I don't know how much longer we can keep this quiet." "What do you mean?" I asked, fear creeping into my voice. "What's she doing now?" Greg finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "She's gone to the mayor. She's trying to get the entire neighborhood behind her, saying that you're causing trouble and that your actions are disrupting the entire community. She's pulling strings in the local government. I've heard rumors she's planning something bigger." My stomach dropped. If Karen had the mayor in her corner, this could get ugly. She was already powerful enough within the HOA. Now she was involving local officials? This wasn't just a fight for my house anymore. This was a fight for everything I believed in. "We need to expose her, and we need to do it fast," I said, standing up from my chair. "I'm not backing down, but if she's pulling those kinds of strings, I'll need more than just the neighborhood behind me." Mrs. Stevens nodded gravely. "We've been talking. We want to help. We want to make sure that Karen is finally stopped, once and for all." Greg pulled out a small folder from his bag and handed it to me. "This is everything," he said. "Pictures, documents, and most importantly, witness statements. There are others who are willing to come forward, but they're scared. They want to remain anonymous for now." I took the folder, my fingers shaking. It was full of evidence, just like the one I had compiled. But this was more. This was the final push I needed to bring Karen down. I looked at both of them, feeling a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," I said quietly. "This could be the key to ending her reign. But we need to be careful. We can't just go to the press again. We need to hit her where it hurts." Greg nodded. "I've got a friend who works for the local news. If we go to them with everything, we'll get the story out there. But we have to make sure Karen can't spin it. We have to control the narrative." I felt the weight of the situation settle over me. We were finally gathering the resources we needed, but this was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for the community. And if Karen had her sights set on the mayor, I had to be ready for whatever she threw my way. "I'll get the story to the press," I said, clenching my fists. "But first, we need to get the local authorities involved. We have to make sure Karen doesn't get away with this." As the evening wore on, we planned our next steps carefully. We couldn't afford any mistakes now. The momentum was building, and the stakes had never been higher. Karen was more dangerous than ever, but I wasn't backing down. This fight wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who had been silenced by her manipulation. The war had just begun. The final showdown was inevitable. I could feel it in my bones. As I prepared to present everything we had, documents, witness statements, and hard evidence, I knew that it wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even about Karen. It was about the entire community. This was bigger than a petty HOA dispute. This was about breaking free from years of corruption and fear. The day I had been preparing for had arrived. Mrs. Stevens, Greg, and a handful of other neighbors who had bravely agreed to speak out were by my side. We had one shot at this, and I was determined not to let it slip away. We were all gathered in the conference room of the local news station. The cameras were rolling, the reporters were ready, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on me. I took a deep breath as I stood in front of the camera. It was now or never. We've been living under the control of a corrupt HOA for far too long. I began, my voice steady but strong. Karen has been using her power to manipulate and extort homeowners in this neighborhood. But today, we're putting an end to it. The camera crew zoomed in as I held up the stack of documents, the evidence that had been compiled over the last few weeks. I watched as the reporter, a young woman with an air of professionalism, nodded. She knew this was big, really big. We've gathered statements from neighbors who were too afraid to speak out until now, I continued. We've documented Karen's attempts to extort money from homeowners, to control their lives, and to use the HOA as a weapon for her personal gain. As I spoke, I could see the reporters' faces shift from mere curiosity to genuine shock. The story was unfolding before them, and they could see just how far Karen had gone to maintain control over the neighborhood. There was no way she could deny it now. This wasn't just one person's word against hers. It was an entire community. The story aired that evening, and the reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with reactions, both from locals and from people around the country who had seen the injustice unfold. The HOA, which had been hiding behind Karen's authoritarian rule for so long, was now under the microscope. People began sharing their own experiences with corrupt HOAs, and the support flooded in. But Karen wasn't going to go down quietly. The next day, as I was sitting at my kitchen table, a knock came at the door. I opened it, half expecting to find Karen standing there, seething with rage. But it wasn't Karen. It was a local official, a representative from the mayor's office. "I'm here to speak with you," he said, glancing at the camera crew set up on the lawn. "I'm afraid things have escalated much further than expected." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's not just about Karen anymore," he said, his voice low. "We've got politicians and other officials involved now. The mayor, he's been receiving pressure to silence this story. And the HOA board has rallied against you." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They were trying to bury the truth. But this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the fight of every person who had been bullied, manipulated, or silenced by Karen and the corrupt HOA. "I'm not backing down," I said, my voice unwavering. "We have the truth on our side. The people of this neighborhood won't stand for this any longer." The representative nodded, though his expression was still grim. "Just be careful. You're up against more than just Karen now. You're taking on a system that's been in place for years." As he left, I felt a fire ignite inside of me. This was bigger than any one person. I had uncovered a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the HOA, and now it was up to me, and all of us, to tear it down. Later that evening, I received another call from the journalist who had helped us break the story. "We've got more attention than we ever anticipated," she said, her voice excited. "The mayor is in full damage control mode now. He's trying to spin this, but the truth is out. You did it. You exposed them." But just as I thought the battle was over, I received a surprising call. It was Karen. I almost didn't answer, but something in her voice made me listen. "You think you've won?" she spat. "You've only scratched the surface. You have no idea what's coming next. You've made a huge mistake." I took a deep breath, knowing this was the final confrontation. "Karen, it's over. People see you for what you are now. You can't intimidate anyone anymore. Your reign is done." There was a long pause before she spoke again. This time, her voice was quieter, almost resigned. "You think you've won, but you haven't. Not yet." I hung up the phone, a sense of finality settling over me. I had exposed Karen, and the community was rallying behind me. The truth had won, and it was only a matter of time before the entire system came crumbling down. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board was disbanded, and Karen's influence began to unravel. The mayor, under immense public pressure, had no choice but to step down. People started to speak out, finally free from the fear that had held them captive for so long. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but this time, it was different. The people had spoken. They had taken back their power. I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been afraid to speak out. And as I stood in front of my house, watching my neighbors come together, I realized that I had done more than expose a corrupt HOA president. I had helped build a community that would no longer allow anyone to control them. It wasn't just my victory, it was our victory. I woke up that morning with no idea that my life was about to be turned upside down. I had just stepped out of the shower when my phone rang. I almost ignored it. Another telemarketer, maybe, or some spam call I didn't need to deal with. But the number on the screen was from the HOA. I froze. What could they possibly want? The HOA had always been in the background, quiet, doing their thing without bothering me much. I had kept my property clean, followed the rules, and never made waves. But something about this call felt different. When I picked up, the voice on the other end sounded calm, almost too calm. "Hello, this is Janet from the HOA board," she said, her tone polite but icy. "We need you to hand over the keys to your house." Immediately, I stared at the phone, unsure if I had heard her correctly. I must have misheard her. "What?" I asked, trying to process the words. "You want what?" The woman repeated herself, this time with a little more authority. "We need to perform a mandatory inspection, and we require full access to your home. Hand over the keys, or there will be consequences." I felt my stomach drop. What was going on? This was the first time I was hearing about an inspection, and certainly the first time someone had demanded my house keys. "I don't understand," I stammered. "What's the inspection for? I've received no notice about this." "Well, it's standard HOA procedure. We need to check your property to ensure compliance with community guidelines," she said, almost as though it was routine. As if it was completely normal for them to show up unannounced and demand access to my personal space. I could feel the frustration building. My house wasn't some public place for them to just waltz in whenever they felt like it. This was my property. No one had the right to tell me what to do with it. I had never signed up for this, but there she was, telling me I had no choice but to comply. This was it. Something had to be done. But at that moment, I wasn't sure what my next move would be. "Why do you need the keys now?" I asked, trying to stay calm. Her response was immediate and blunt. "We've been receiving complaints. You're in violation of multiple HOA rules. We need to investigate, and we're starting with your home." My heart raced. Complaints? What complaints? None of this made any sense. "I'm sorry," I said, finally finding my voice. "I'm not handing over my keys to anyone without proper notice or explanation. This feels completely wrong." She didn't take kindly to my refusal. "If you don't comply, the HOA will escalate this situation. You don't want to make this harder on yourself, do you?" The threat in her voice was clear. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. I hung up the phone, my mind spinning. What had just happened? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how out of control this situation had become. I had to figure out what was going on. Fast, I paced around my living room, trying to gather my thoughts. This couldn't be happening. I had read stories about people dealing with power-hungry HOA boards, but I never thought it would happen to me. I've always followed the rules, paid my dues on time, and kept my property in good condition. I even helped out neighbors when they needed it. So why was I suddenly the target? I grabbed my laptop and started digging into the HOA's rules, trying to figure out if they had any legal grounds for what they were demanding. The more I searched, the more furious I became. There was nothing that gave them the right to demand keys or force me to allow access to my home on a whim. I had done nothing wrong. But the more I read, the clearer it became. HOA boards are notorious for overstepping their boundaries, especially when they think they have more authority than they actually do. They've been known to bully homeowners into compliance, and sometimes they even use threats of legal action to intimidate people into submission. And then it hit me. That's exactly what this was. They were trying to intimidate me, hoping I would cave in and hand over the keys without question. Well, I wasn't about to let that happen. I needed to take action. I decided to reach out to a lawyer. I wasn't about to deal with this on my own, not when the HOA was clearly trying to take advantage of me. I called a local attorney who specialized in property rights and explained the situation. He listened carefully, and after a moment of silence, he told me exactly what I needed to hear. "You're right to question this," he said. "What they're doing is illegal. They have no right to demand your house keys, and they certainly can't just show up at your home whenever they feel like it. The HOA is limited in what they can enforce, and this falls well outside their jurisdiction." Relief washed over me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being unreasonable. The law was on my side. But even with this knowledge, I knew the HOA wouldn't back down that easily. They weren't going to stop at just one phone call. I had to be ready. So, I took a deep breath, gathered all my documents, my property deed, the original HOA agreement, and anything else that might help me defend my rights, and prepared for the next battle. I wasn't going to hand over my keys, but I had a feeling this wouldn't be over anytime soon. I couldn't let them win. I had worked hard for my home, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry board members push me around. But then, just as I was getting ready to make my next move, the doorbell rang. I froze. Who could that be? I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked cautiously toward the door, peeking through the peephole. My heart skipped a beat when I saw who it was. Standing there, with an expression of entitlement written all over her face, was none other than Karen, the HOA board member who had called me earlier. My mind raced. What did she want now? And why had she come to my door instead of just calling again? This was either going to be a confrontation or an attempt to intimidate me further. I wasn't sure which, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. I took a deep breath and opened the door, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen. I opened the door, and there she stood, Karen, the HOA board member, with a smug smile on her face that I could practically feel through the door. She looked like she was used to getting what she wanted, like no one had ever dared to stand up to her. But today, that was about to change. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "I'm here to talk about the keys," she said, her voice smooth, but with a hint of underlying irritation. "You know, it's really inconvenient for everyone when you refuse to cooperate. We're just trying to do our job and make sure the neighborhood stays nice." I could feel my blood pressure rising as I looked at her. Was she seriously standing there, acting like she had any authority over my property? She was a board member. Sure, but that didn't mean she could walk into my house or make demands like this. "I told you on the phone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not handing over my keys. I don't care what your job is. I'm not letting you into my home without proper notice and reason. I don't even know what this inspection is for." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could tell she wasn't used to being challenged. She stepped closer to the door, her body language demanding compliance. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but you're making this much harder than it has to be," she said. "We've been more than patient, and you're causing a disruption. People are starting to talk, and the HOA won't just let you block access to the neighborhood. This is a serious issue." She was trying to manipulate me, and it was clear as day. The more she spoke, the more I realized how ridiculous this whole situation had become. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my private property, and Karen was acting like she could just waltz in and take control because she was on the board. But I wasn't going to let that happen. "You don't have the right to do this," I said, my voice firm now. "You can't just come to my house and demand access. This is my property, and I have every right to decide who comes and goes." Karen's face flushed red, and for a brief moment, I thought she might lose her cool. But she quickly regained her composure, like she had done this a million times before. "You're making a huge mistake. The HOA will take action. You'll regret this, I promise you." I could see she was trying to intimidate me, but it wasn't going to work. I had already talked to my lawyer, and I knew my rights. I wasn't about to back down just because some entitled HOA member thought she could walk all over me. "Karen," I said, holding up my hand to stop her, "I've already spoken to my lawyer. The HOA has no legal standing here. You can't just barge into my home and demand things. So, I suggest you leave before this gets worse." For a second, There was silence. Her eyes burned with anger, but I could tell she was weighing her options. She wasn't used to hearing no, especially not from someone like me. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out her next move. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off my porch. But as she walked away, she muttered something under her breath, something that made my blood run cold. "You'll regret this. The HOA won't let you get away with it." I closed the door behind me, my mind racing. Was she really going to escalate this further? Was I about to get dragged into some long, drawn-out legal battle with the HOA? I didn't know what she'd do next, but I was ready for it. I wasn't going to let her or the HOA intimidate me into backing down. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Actually, I kept expecting some kind of retaliation, maybe a letter from the HOA, or even another visit from Karen. But nothing came. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, that Karen was just waiting for the right moment to strike again. I had been through enough to know that these things never just disappear, especially when an HOA was involved. Then, out of nowhere, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the HOA, and my stomach dropped when I saw the envelope. It looked official, serious. I hadn't expected them to let it go so easily, but this letter made it clear that they weren't done with me yet. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking slightly as I read the contents. It was a formal notice of violation, claiming that I had blocked a public access point, and that my actions were in direct violation of the HOA's rules. The letter demanded that I remove the gate immediately or face legal action. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was insane. They had no right to dictate what I did with my own property. But here they were, sending me a letter like they had all the power in the world. They were trying to force me into submission, hoping I would cave in and do what they wanted. I knew I couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was about standing my ground and making sure that the HOA understood that they couldn't bully me into giving up my rights. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to take things to the next level. The HOA had already made their move, but now it was my turn. I wasn't just going to respond to their threats. I was going to make sure that everyone knew the truth about what was happening. But I needed to be smart about it. I had to gather all the evidence I could, make sure I had everything in place before I made my next move. This was far from over. In fact, I had a feeling it was only just beginning. The letter was just the beginning of a long and tiresome game of cat and mouse. I knew they wouldn't back down so easily. The HOA was persistent, and they had power in numbers. But I wasn't about to be intimidated or bullied into giving up what was mine. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could to protect myself. I contacted my lawyer again, and this time I asked for more than just advice. I needed a plan. We went over everything from the HOA's regulations to property rights, and I made sure I had the legal framework to defend myself in any situation. We even started preparing for the possibility of a court battle, knowing that Karen wasn't going to let up. I also began to document everything. I took photos of the gate and the property lines. I gathered maps from the township showing that the strip of land wasn't part of the neighborhood. I even started recording the conversations I had with the HOA representatives, just in case they tried to twist the facts later. And just as I thought things were settling down, it happened again. One afternoon, while I was out running errands, I got a call from my neighbor, Greg. He was an older guy who lived a few doors down and, unlike most of the neighbors, he wasn't afraid to speak up when something didn't sit right with him. "Hey, I just saw something you're going to want to know about," Greg said, his voice low, like he was trying not to be overheard. "Karen and a couple of her friends from the HOA were standing by your gate earlier. They were taking pictures of your property, and I'm pretty sure they're planning something." My stomach sank. I had a bad feeling that this wasn't going to end well. I knew Karen wasn't going to give up without a fight, but this felt different. It wasn't just about the gate anymore. It was personal. "Thanks, Greg," I said, my mind racing. "I'll deal with it. Just keep an eye out, all right?" The moment I hung up, I felt a sense of urgency wash over me. I wasn't about to let Karen and the HOA walk all over me. This had become more than just a disagreement over property. This was about setting a boundary, about standing up for what was mine. I called my lawyer again, and we discussed the possibility of taking further legal action. At this point, I had done everything right. The HOA had no legal grounds to demand anything from me. But that didn't stop them from trying. And now, it seemed like they were escalating things. The next day, I got a surprise. A truck pulled up in front of my house, and I saw the familiar faces of Karen and two other HOA board members. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were here to intimidate me further, to see if they could break me down. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I stepped outside to meet them, my heart pounding in my chest. Karen was the first to speak, as always. "We've had enough of your defiance," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're making this difficult for everyone, and the HOA has had enough. We've decided to take action." I tried to remain calm, but the anger bubbling up inside me was hard to suppress. "What action?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fury coursing through me. "You can't just come here and tell me what to do. This is my property, and I've done nothing wrong." Karen ignored me, turning to one of the other board members. "We've decided that we'll be filing an official complaint against you for blocking public access to this road," she said. "We've been using this route for years, and you have no right to stop us." I shook my head, incredulous. "You really think you can get away with this? You have no legal standing here. This is my private property, and I'm not going to let you bully me into giving up my rights." They continued to argue with me, throwing around vague threats of legal action and insisting that I was in the wrong. But no matter how many times they said it, I knew the truth. I had the law on my side. I wasn't going to back down. "Let me make this clear," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "I've spoken to my lawyer, and I know exactly what I'm entitled to. You cannot force me to open my gate or hand over my keys. This is my home, and you have no authority here." Karen's face flushed with anger, but she didn't back down. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "The HOA will come after you. You'll regret this." I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. I wasn't going to let them win. The HOA had been overstepping their bounds for too long, and I wasn't about to let them push me around. The encounter ended with Karen and the other board members storming off, their faces red with rage. But I knew this wasn't over. They were just getting started. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. I wasn't sure what it was, but I had a feeling that the HOA wasn't going to let me off the hook so easily. The only thing I could do now was prepare for whatever came next. I wasn't going to let them win, not without a fight. And just as I predicted, the next day brought another surprise. A letter arrived, this time marked urgent. I tore it open, bracing myself for whatever ridiculous claim they were making now. This time, the HOA wasn't just demanding I remove the gate. They were threatening to take me to court over it. The letter was filled with legal jargon, trying to convince me that I was in violation of some supposed community easement. The HOA claimed that, because people had used the path as a shortcut for years, they now had the right to use it whenever they wanted. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was a blatant attempt to bully me into submission, but I wasn't going to let them win. I had to stay strong. I had already done my research, and I knew I was in the right. The HOA may have thought they could scare me into giving up, but they were wrong. This fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. I sat there for a while, staring at the letter from the HOA, trying to process everything. The nerve they had to make such bold threats, acting like they had some claim over my private property. It was as if they thought I was just going to roll over and let them have their way. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Not now, not ever. I called my lawyer the moment I got my bearings. We went over the letter together, and he confirmed what I already knew. The HOA was bluffing. They had no legal grounds to force me to remove the gate. But they weren't going to back off just because I knew my rights. This was about power, and the HOA wasn't used to losing control. We strategized. My lawyer assured me that I was in a strong position, but we needed to be prepared for the next step. It was clear they were gearing up for a court battle, but I wasn't scared. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. I started organizing all my evidence. The property maps, the photos of the gate, the letter from the HOA, even the footage from my security cameras showing Karen's behavior. I made sure everything was in order, ready to present if needed. But in the back of my mind, I had an idea, something that could change the entire course of this ordeal. I decided to take the situation public. A couple of days later, I reached out to a local news station that had been covering similar HOA issues. I wasn't sure if they'd bite, but I figured it couldn't hurt to try. To my surprise, they responded quickly. They were interested in hearing more about my case, and they wanted to do an interview. This was the chance I'd been waiting for. I knew that if I could get the media involved, it would put a massive spotlight on the HOA's abuse of power. They wouldn't be able to hide behind their threats anymore. The public would know exactly what they were doing, and that could force them to back off. A few days later, I sat down for the interview. The camera crew set up in my living room, and I could feel the tension building. This was it, the moment I'd been preparing for. The interviewer asked me to explain my side of the story, and I did. I told them everything. How the HOA had demanded access to my property without notice, how they had threatened me with legal action, and how they were trying to bully me into compliance. I made sure to mention how I had consulted with a lawyer, how I had done everything by the book, and how the HOA had no legal grounds to force me to remove the gate. I explained how this was a personal stand for my rights and my home. The interviewer was supportive, nodding as I spoke, clearly sympathetic to my situation. But I wasn't done yet. I dropped the bombshell. Karen, one of the board members, had even shown up at my house demanding my keys. She called the police on me, as if she had some right to control my property. I could see the interviewer's eyes widen as I shared the details. This was the moment that would change everything. The interview aired that evening, and the response was overwhelming. The local community was outraged. People flooded social media with comments and messages of support, sharing their own experiences with HOA overreach. It was like a wildfire, spreading fast. Neighbors I didn't even know came forward, saying they had dealt with similar issues. It felt like the whole town was rallying behind me. The next morning, Karen called, but this time, her tone was completely different. Gone was the smug attitude. She was almost apologetic, like the weight of the situation had finally hit her. "I saw the news," she said, her voice quiet and tense. "I didn't realize how this was affecting you. I think I overreacted, and I'm sorry. I couldn't believe what I was hearing." Was this really Karen, the woman who had spent the last few weeks threatening me? She was admitting she was wrong? It felt like a victory, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. "I'm glad you finally understand," I said, trying to stay calm. "But this isn't over. The HOA has no right to interfere with my property. And if this ever happens again, I'll take it straight to court. Don't think for a second that I'll back down." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Karen's voice came back, softer now. "You're right. The HOA has no claim here. I'll make sure to bring this up at the next board meeting. I'm sorry for how this all went down." For a moment, I felt a sense of satisfaction, but I knew the HOA wouldn't give up so easily. They had already shown their true colors, and Karen wasn't about to stop pushing for her own agenda. A few days later, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was different. It was an official letter of apology, acknowledging that they had overstepped their bounds and that they would no longer pursue any legal action against me. They had no choice. The media coverage, the public outcry, and the overwhelming support from the community had forced them to back down. The letter was signed by the board president, and it included a reminder to all HOA members that they had to respect the boundaries of private property. It also mentioned that Karen had been advised to step down from her position on the board, though they didn't go into details. I wasn't sure what that meant for Karen, but I knew it was a big blow to her. The battle was over. The HOA had backed down, and my property was safe. But the experience had changed me. I had learned just how far some people would go to impose their will, and how important it was to stand up for what's right. The fight with the HOA wasn't just about a gate or a piece of land. It was about standing my ground, about refusing to let anyone, no matter how powerful they thought they were, take away my rights. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace. The gate was still up, and no one was trespassing on my property anymore. I had one. As for Karen, I haven't seen her since the board meeting. I'm guessing she's learned her lesson. As for the HOA, well, I'll be keeping a close eye on them. You never know when another Karen might come around, but this time, I'll be ready.